Hello everyone, it's Shannon here, and I'm so excited because today I'm guesting at the stamp market, and I have this awesome shaker card to share with you featuring the Lovely Labels stamp bundle. This awesome card has no craft foam, no foam tape whatsoever, and I'm so excited to share it, so let's get started. This is the Lovely Labels stamp set. I love this set. The sentiments are wonderful, the font is gorgeous, and I also have the Lovely Labels nested dies stored in the back here. I'm going to start with 5 A2 panels, so they are 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. 4 of these panels will actually make up the well for our shaker card, and I also have an A2 top folding card base as well. I'm going to start with an A2 panel, and I'm going to grab the largest die from the Lovely Labels nested die set, and I'm going to center it here on this A2 panel. I like to use my acetate grid to help me make sure it's centered. I can kind of count the little grid boxes and really make sure that die is perfectly centered, a little bit better than I can just eyeball it. And once I get it there, I will grab a couple pieces of micropore tape and hold that die in place. I like to try to make that micropore tape only in the inside part of the die because I'm not going to keep the cardstock in there, so if the tape leaves any impressions, you're not going to see it because I'm discarding that inside piece. I'm now going to use this die cut panel as a guide to help me stamp a frame from the Lovely Labels stamp set. First, I grabbed another A2 panel, placed it inside my MISTI, and then placed the die cut panel on top. I'll use that opening inside that panel to help me position this largest frame stamp from the Lovely Labels stamp set. So I'm going to lean over side to side just to make sure it's perfectly centered in there, and once I get it centered, I'll fold my MISTI over and pick up the stamp, and then I'll ink it up. I'm going to use the Distress Oxide. The first color I'm using is Worn Lipstick. I'll just ink that stamp up and then stamp it onto the panel. I did remove the die cut panel first before I stamped it just to make sure I didn't accidentally get any ink on that panel. As you can see here, that die cut panel frames that frame stamp beautifully, and now I'm going to take the second largest die from the nested die set and cut out that inside negative section of this frame. Once I get this die centered, I'll grab a couple pieces of micropore tape to hold it in place, and then I'll run it through my die cutting machine. Once it's run through, I've completed the first layer for my shaker well. I'm now going to use this panel to help me center my next stamp on my next panel. So I grabbed another blank A2 panel and then placed the die cut panel on top, and now I'm centering the second largest frame stamp from the Lovely Labels stamp set. Once I have it centered, I then picked it up with my MISTI, and I'm now going to ink it up with another Distress Oxide. This is Spiced Marmalade. So this panel is actually my third panel. I have 2 more to go. I'm now going to cut out the center of this panel using the third largest nested die. So I've just grabbed that, centered it, again grabbed a couple pieces of micropore tape to hold it in place, and now I will run it through my die cutting machine. Even though this is my third panel, it'll actually be the second layer in my well. The very first panel is actually going to be the top of our shaker card and not part of the well. I've now used this panel to help me center my next frame stamp. Again, I started with a blank A2 panel, then placed the die cut panel on top, centered the frame stamp, picked it up with a MISTI, and now I'm stamping it in my next Distress Oxide color, which is Mustard Seed. Just like with the other panels, I'm going to die cut that negative space out. I'm using the fourth largest die here, or second smallest die here, depends on how you look at it. Centered it, then used a couple pieces of micropore tape to hold it in place, and then ran it through my die cutting machine. I'm now going to use this panel, just like I did with the others, to help me center the next frame stamp. And once I get it centered, I'll pick it up with my MISTI, and then I'll ink it up with a Distress Oxide again. This time it is Lucky Clover. Once all inked up, I'll then stamp it, and then I'll move to die cutting that center out again on my very last A2 panel. So this is my very last panel here, and I'm using the smallest die from the nested Lovely Labels die set. So I'm just going to die cut that out, and that will complete my last panel for my well. I now have my A2 top folding card base here. I'm going to load it into my MISTI, grab this panel I just stamped, and use it to help me stamp the very last frame stamp from the Lovely Labels stamp set. I'll then ink up the stamp with my last Distress Oxide, which is Tumbled Glass, and then stamp it onto my card base. And this will actually be the very back of my shaker card. I'm now going to finish up the top panel for my shaker card. I have an A2 panel here of acetate. The acetate actually has a little piece of like parchment paper behind it here, and I'm just going to leave it there as long as possible to reduce my fingerprints that I might get on the acetate. And I'm going to grab that very first panel that we die cut in the very beginning and use it to help me center my sentiment. The sentiment again is from the Lovely Labels stamp set. Once I get it centered, I'll just pick it up with my MISTI, and then I will ink it up with my ink. Going to make sure though that the acetate is definitely centered and down in that very corner of my MISTI, and then I'm going to ink it up with a StazOn. This works really well for stamping on acetate. This is just jet black. If you've never worked with StazOn before, it is very permanent, and you will have to, it dries instantly, but you will have to use a stamp cleaner to remove it off of your stamp. So once it's stamped, I'm now ready to move on to completing that front panel for my shaker card. So I've got that same white panel that I had before, the very first one I made, and I'm going to add some Tombow Mono multi-liquid adhesive to the back side of it, and then I'll just adhere it on top of that stamped acetate. I'm careful when I apply my glue to keep it away from the center opening. I just don't want any of that glue to squish out and be visible in that window of my and on the acetate. Once I've got that in place, I'm now going to build my well, starting with my card base and then working my way up through all my layers, except for that very top layer that we just created. We'll add that very last. So those are all my layers. It creates a beautiful rainbow. Once I got them in place, I'll then flip them over and then start gluing them. Again, I'm going to use some liquid glue here, and again, I'm trying to be careful not to get too much of that glue near the center opening because I don't want it to kind of squish out and then be like a sticky spot for the sequins to kind of stick to. And I just repeat this process for each one of my layers till I have this well completed. I also will take my panels and kind of tap them on the base of my table, on the bottom of my table, or the base of the card, and that just helps to make sure everything's centered and perfectly in place. And this is my very last panel here, and that will complete my well. I'll just give a good press all around to make sure all those panels are stuck snugly together. And as you can see here, it creates a well. It's dimensional because of all the layers of cardstock, and it will house our sequins beautifully. So I have some clear sequins here, and I'm going to open up the pack and just sprinkle them right inside my well. And then I will take an X-Acto knife and just kind of move them around so they're not all stacked up upon each other, so there's not like a mountain of sequins. I want it kind of be all one level. I also like to move the sequins up to the highest levels of my stamped cardstock. I do this just to make sure I trap some sequins up at the upper layers of my shaker card. I like to have some of that sequins kind of spread around a little bit and not all at the very bottom. I just think I like that sparkle kind of spread around. So I just added some glue to the back of my front panel and then stuck it right down and trapped all those sequins right inside that well, and that completes my shaker card. I did place some weight on it while it dried, and now my card is all done, and I'll hold it to the camera so you can get a good look at this card. I love how the shaker card turned out. I love the rainbow colors. I love how clean and simple it is. I actually made a second card that I'll show you here in a second that I used some different rainbow colors. First was Worn Lipstick again, then Candied Apple, then Wild Honey, then Mowed Lawn, and then Tumbled Glass. So a little different rainbow there, but still really beautiful. You could really use whatever colors you want to create this card. You could use some warm tones or some cool tones instead. And I really love that we didn't have to use any foam tape or any craft foam to create this shaker card. I hope you guys enjoyed today's card and project. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.